They told you America was the land of freedom, that anyone, regardless of their background, could rise to greatness. They told you the founding fathers were flawless heroes, that slavery was a tragic but brief misstep, and that America only ever fought for justice, liberty, and peace. They gave you names to worship, dates to memorize, and battles to glorify. And you believed it. You believed it because you were a child, and they wrapped it in a flag, stamped it with authority, and called it truth. But what if I told you that almost everything in your U.S. history textbook was either incomplete, misleading, or entirely false? What if I told you that your education wasn't about truth? It was about control. This isn't a conspiracy theory, this is documented reality. For over a century, American history textbooks have been tools, not of enlightenment, but of manipulation. Sanitized stories, censored events, and distorted figures, all carefully curated to maintain a national identity rooted not in truth, but in myth. You were taught about the Revolutionary War, but not the fact that thousands of enslaved people fought for the British because they were promised freedom. You were taught that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, but not that he said, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." You were taught about the civil rights movement, but only the parts that made America look good in hindsight. And you were never taught about how that same government tried to destroy Martin Luther King Jr. Why were these truths hidden? Because truth empowers people to question, and people who question are harder to control. What you weren't told was that history in America isn't written to tell the truth. It's written to serve power. The biggest textbook markets like Texas and California have enormous influence over what gets published. If a school board in Texas doesn't want students to learn about systemic racism or indigenous genocide, publishers rewrite history to fit those demands. Because at the end of the day, textbooks are a business. And in business, selling books means selling a story people want to hear, not necessarily the truth. So when Texas demanded the word slavery be replaced with involuntary relocation, publishers made the change. When they pushed to downplay civil rights leaders who were too radical or erase references to LGBTQ Americans, it was done silently. Because if you control the textbook, you control the minds of millions of children. And if you control the children, you control the future. You were never supposed to learn that Native American societies had advanced agricultural systems, governments, and cities long before Columbus arrived. You were never supposed to learn that Columbus never even stepped foot on the land that is now the United States, or that his arrival marked the beginning of centuries of violence, enslavement, and genocide against indigenous peoples. Instead, you were taught to celebrate him. You had Columbus Day off school. You did art projects about his discovery. But what did he actually discover? Nothing. The land was already inhabited. What he brought wasn't civilization, it was death, forced labor, and destruction. You probably didn't learn that the U.S. broke every single treaty it signed with native tribes, over 500 in total. You weren't told that entire cultures were wiped out not just by disease, but by deliberate massacres, starvation policies, and forced assimilation through boarding schools that stripped children of their language, culture, and identity. You weren't taught about the 1898 Wilmington coup, when a legally elected multiracial government was violently overthrown by white supremacists. The only successful coup d'etat in U.S. history. You probably didn't hear about it because it would challenge the narrative that American democracy has always worked. And what about slavery? In most textbooks, slavery is mentioned but not fully explained. You learned about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, but you weren't shown the brutal everyday reality of slavery, families torn apart, rape, torture, and lives treated as property. You didn't read about the forced breeding of enslaved women or the children sold away from their parents. It was mentioned like a bad policy decision, not the foundational system that built the nation's economy. Even after slavery ended, the story was censored. You weren't taught about black codes, convict leasing, or how the 13th Amendment allowed slavery to continue under the name of punishment. You weren't told that major American corporations grew rich off prison labor, essentially legal slavery that continues to this day. The same silence surrounds America's labor history. Did your textbook tell you about the Ludlow Massacre, where women and children were burned alive by National Guard troops for participating in a miners' strike? Did it mention how child labor was rampant during the Industrial Revolution, or how people died fighting for the 8-hour workday? Probably not, because that would make American capitalism look violent and exploitative, and textbooks prefer a cleaner story, one where everyone succeeds if they just try hard enough. You learned about World War II and how America defeated the Nazis, but not that before the war, American companies like IBM, Ford, and General Motors were doing business with Hitler. You didn't learn that Henry Ford was admired by the Nazis for his anti-Semitic writings, or that Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust were turned away by the U.S., forced to return to Europe where many were killed. You were told that America was the hero, but not that the U.S. government also conducted unethical human experiments like the Tuskegee study, where black men with syphilis were denied treatment just to see what would happen. You weren't taught about Conhelpro, the FBI's illegal surveillance and harassment program targeting civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and black organizations. You probably didn't learn that the government tried to blackmail Martin Luther King Jr. into suicide, or that it infiltrated Black Panther chapters to incite violence and discredit their movement. You were told about the Cold War, but not how the U.S. helped overthrow democratically elected governments in Iran, Guatemala, Chile, and more. Not that the CIA trained death squads in Central America. Not that U.S. foreign policy has often supported dictators when it suited economic interests. You learned about the Vietnam War, but maybe not about the My Lai massacre, where over 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, mostly women and children, were murdered by American troops. And maybe your textbook skipped over the Kent State shootings, where unarmed college students protesting the war were shot dead by the National Guard. You were taught to love the flag, but not to ask what it's done. Your textbooks probably praised Ronald Reagan for his leadership and economic reforms, but didn't explain how his policies gutted mental health funding, widened the wealth gap, and led to the explosion of the prison population. You weren't told that the war on drugs was strategically used to target Black and Latino communities, a fact admitted decades later by Reagan's own staff. And when it comes to climate change, corporate power, or mass surveillance, you were told next to nothing. Because history isn't just about the past, it's about shaping how people see the present. If you believe America has always been the good guy, you're less likely to notice its current abuses, less likely to resist, less likely to ask hard questions. You were taught to memorize names and dates, but not to think critically. And that was the point. Because if you started asking why, you'd start seeing patterns. You'd realize that systemic oppression didn't end, it evolved. You'd realize that what happened to Native Americans, enslaved Africans, women, immigrants, and the working class isn't ancient history. It's the foundation of today's inequality. But here's the truth. You don't have to accept the sanitized version anymore. You have access to more information than any generation before you. You can read the stories that were silenced. You can listen to the voices that were erased. You can question what you were taught and demand the truth. Because history belongs to all of us, not just the victors, not just the publishers, not just the powerful. And once you see through the lies, you start to understand something deeper. That history isn't just something you read about. It's something you're still living. And if you want a better future, you have to start by telling the whole truth about the past.